our task for today. We are stacking the best teams to never win a college football national championship up against each other. All of us have put together a list, top 10. I got a couple others that I think would be good for debate. But before we get started, I'd be curious to hear what were some of the guiding principles or sort of overarching takeaways that might have come out from trying to go through this exercise.
Well, we decided we were doing post-segregation because that would make it a lot simpler and easier, because it's hard to, for us especially, to know what football was really like before that, because we didn't get to see the teams. And I kind of took that same approach with my own teams, where I have some teams on my list from the 80s, the early 80s, but if I wasn't, most of my list focuses on the 90s and afterward, because that's when I was actually paying attention and feel like I can speak to something.
I think it illustrates just how often the best team did not win the national title, especially in the pre-BCS era, and obviously, I think the playoff does a better job of selecting the national champ. I mean, there are some years in the 80s in which multiple teams were, I think, pretty clearly better than the team that actually won the national title, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, but it really does hammer home just how bad we were at selecting national champions for a while. The other thing I really tried to focus on was, I don't want you on my list if you got crushed by a team that was not the national champion in that year, right? Like, I'll excuse a loss if you were really dominant in a bunch of other really good games. But I was talking to Oklahoma fans earlier, and of course they love me. And I was like, look, I think you guys have like 6 teams on this list. And you're like, oh, what about 03? And I was like, not really for 03 for me. I mean, that Kansas State team was not like that level to get whipped like that. So
I thought it was interesting how many, like, doing research for this, other people have compiled similar lists, and it's like football didn't exist before the BCS. Like, really, most of the lists only go back to 98, 99, 2000. Like, there aren't many that there's a deeper list run. So I'll be curious to see if you guys went off there. And looking back, there were only a couple that I would make a strong case for. And then I also think it's interesting when you do these lists too. Like, if we think of Miami's dynasty with the 5 national championships and Alabama's dynasty of the past 15 years, like, how much more it could have been a dynasty. Even USC, there have been some programs, like, when you're in those dynastic years, like, you can capitalize them, and man, how close they were to just having runs of way more than even the already impressive number of championships they already had.
The programs that were independent consistently got screwed. That was something that came up for me a lot, where Pitt, Florida State, Penn State, Notre Dame, and Miami, all independents during the time, at some point during the time when we were looking at this, where you got drawn to a different game, and the team that you played might have had 3 losses, while the program that was eventually named national champion had a better opponent. And if those programs had a better opportunity into a bowl game and had a more quality opponent, then they might have won. And as those same programs, particularly Florida State, Penn State, and Miami, as they continue to pop up again and again and again, I would go ahead and say to those fan bases listening or watching live, it got boring. I just started picking, like, all right, listen, we can't have that much Miami. We can't have that much Florida State. We got to start singling out who we want to have on the list. So that might be a place where I will admit there's a little bit of bias here. And then in terms, like Tom said, I did find myself trying to not overreach what my own knowledge was. And so it's not BCS only, Danny. I get a little bit into the 80s, but I think that our cutoff, I used 1970 as the hard line, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. I think every team post 70 to win on this list was post integration.
So we've got the chat is already filling up with all your own suggestions. And so that's very exciting. I'm glad there's a lot of interest in this. So one way that I thought would be basically to go from the top down and sort of allow us to pass around and identify the highest rated not discussed. Bud, I'm going to start with you. This was your idea. So I want to hear Bud Elliott's number 1 team not to win a national championship. and then we'll work, let's say, counterclockwise. Danny, then Tom, and basically you'll follow with your highest rated not discussed. We can break it down, see where that team falls on everyone's list.
All right, so like to me, I thought there were three that really were just stood out among the rest here, and two are from the 80s. One is from the 90s. I'm gonna go 1994 Penn State. That team was unbelievably good. They were loaded on both sides of the ball. Obviously, they're in our cover photo for this thing. They smoked a bunch of ranked teams. Like that one to me, Danny, you would have, obviously you didn't play those guys, but you played alongside a lot of those guys in the league. That was one of the ones that stands out to me as like, oh my God, this is just. Now, granted, you had a really good national title team that year in Nebraska. And that's another commonality, by the way, is that a lot of times these teams that didn't win, when they actually did get the national champion right in that year, a lot of times that was like one of the all-time teams. That 94 Nebraska team was no joke, but they didn't get to play each other, right? I mean, they played in the Rose Bowl. They beat Oregon by 3 scores.
That wasn't even a top 10 team going into the game. Like they were in the Big Ten.
That's that conference affiliation.
Rose Bowl, but it was still like the conference affiliation sending you off where you might have to play an opponent that's not going to be good enough for the voters to elevate you. Again, Penn State was not independent, so it doesn't perfectly fit what I was talking about earlier.
They've been independent for a while though.
But
before that, they joined in '91.
To your point, I've got that
team. Second season, I think, in the Big Ten.
Okay, so
I've got that team number 2. Yeah, I've got number 2 on my list, and it was the same thing where I was like, this team was unbelievable. And then you look at it, and it was really only the fact that, they didn't have a quality enough opponent to be able to get the nod. Finish number 2 at 12-0 overall, 8-0 in the Big Ten. So yeah, I've got them as number 2 on my list.
It was the year that Penn State really put the offense, they always played really good defense under Joe Pa, and in that you're like, hey, here's 48 points a game for that ass. Okay, and it was something else.
Yeah, we won't mention who the defensive coordinator on that team was, but I will say, like you mentioned the offense just now, this team was also number 2 on my list because Kerry Collins was the quarterback. But what's really stands out, like Kajana Carter was the running back. I think he went number 1 in the draft, right? Top 3 at least. But think of the era in the early 90s. They had Bobby Ingram, who finished with over 1,000 yards receiving. And then Freddie Scott was 27 yards short. He finished with 973 yards receiving. That was a team that in 1994 nearly had 2,000-yard receivers, which is not something you saw a whole lot of in college at that time.
But wait, there's more. Danny, you'll know this name. You know who the tight end was on that team?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was the heck's his name?
Who is it?
White dude.
Kyle Brady.
Kyle Brady.
Yeah.
That was a loaded squad.
Yep. Phil Collins.
How many other years in the 90s?
Not Phil Collins.
If you put them in a lot of other years, I think they probably win it. They just happened to be in a year where they didn't get matched up, and Nebraska was also really good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Danny, who's your number 1? Or it was Penn State where was Penn State on your list?
No, I had him in the top 3. I didn't have him number 1. So the criteria that Bud was kind of talking about being so close in a couple different games. So I had the 2005 USC team with Reggie Bush and Matt Leinart, the Vince Young Rose Bowl. If Vince Young doesn't happen, they're right there, and it's so close. The talent was littered all over the team. They came in as the number 1 ranked team. They were actually a touchdown favorite in that game, came up just short, but NFL talent littered all over the field. I think that for me was one of those ones that defending national champ could have come in back to back. A lot of those players were returning. I just thought that team was one of the best to come up just short and almost, coming up so close. They, for me, were one of the top for sure.
I had them at number 6.
I had them top 10 as well.
Yeah, I had, because like you said, Matt Leinart had a great season that year. They had both Reggie Bush and Lindale White. We just talked about how Penn State nearly had 2,000-yard receivers. Well, that year USC had 2,000-yard rushers. Reggie Bush had 1,740 yards rushing. Lindale White was right behind him with 1,302. They were both awesome out of the backfield as well. In the receiving core, they had Dwayne Jarrett going for over 1,000 yards. Steve Smith nearly had 1,000 yards. That was a team full of stars. And then on the defensive side of the ball, it was just NFL players everywhere you looked.
So I had them number 1, like Danny. And my other note here, they ripped through their regular season schedule. 9 of the 12 regular season wins were by 17 points or more. It was not even close. It was offense. It was defense. It was just a total domination all through that team. And Danny, like you mentioned, except for a mistake, hey, let's just lateral this ball right now. And except for a tremendous final historic drive by Vince Young, then USC isn't even eligible for this discussion because of the national championship. So I am Danny, I'm right there with you. I had USC as my number 1, Penn State as my number 2. I like USC as one of the best teams. That one, it was filling up the chat already. I feel like that's a popular one because of how close and competitive that BCS national championship game was, not to mention the NFL talent and the way they dominated throughout the regular season.
Yeah, and another little factoid about that team. They played 13 games. They scored at least 50 points in 7 of them. They never scored fewer than 34 points in a single game.
And there were some, the blips for some of these teams was a way off I don't want to spoil this, but I'll just go ahead and offhandedly, the 2012 Oregon team was phenomenal, but its one loss was to Stanford. And that game was way off the radar from the way that everything else had gone. 13-3 Stanford win. And it was what happened to this, Chip Kelly year 4, Marcus Mariota year 1, what happened to this high flying offense? It got contained. There was no containing this USC team. They could only be outscored. All right, Tom, who's your highest ranked not mentioned?
All right, my number 1, still on the board, the greatest team of all time to never win a national title. And it happened a couple of years ago because the greatest team of all time did win the national title. 2019 Ohio State.
Yeah.
I've got them on my list.
This was a team that finished the regular season undefeated, absolutely dominated teams. I mean, they were winning, they had 42-0 win over Cincinnati. They beat Indiana by 41. They beat Miami of Ohio by 71. This was a team that was just blowing every single team out of the water every week, gets to the Big Ten championship game, takes down a very good Wisconsin team, and then gets to the playoff and is in that classic semifinal against Clemson, in which Clemson pulls out the 29-23 win. And in the closing seconds, there's Ohio State fans still a little bitter about some of the calls that happened in that game. And then obviously LSU beat Clemson in the national title. And I think LSU probably would have beat Ohio State in the national title game too, but I think it would have been a really good game. But I think that Ohio State team a lot of really good players in that team. Obviously, Justin Fields was at quarterback. J.K. Dobbins rushed for over 2,000 yards that season. They had a young Chris Olave, a young Garrett Wilson. They had K.J. Hill, Benjamin Victor. They also had this freshman receiver who only caught 6 passes that year, but it was for 112 yards and a touchdown. His name was Jamison Williams. That was a loaded freaking Ohio State team. And I think in any other year, if that LSU team didn't exist, we would have thought we would remember that team a lot differently.
I thought I was going to be all hated out of this room by all the historical edges by having the Buckeyes at 9. Tom doing me a big favor and throwing them right at the top of the list. I love it. I 100% agree that that's one of the best teams to never win. And I don't know, full support here.
It's a little lofty, I think.
Yeah,
you make the case for it. I can understand the case for it. There might be a little recency bias in there, but I get it.
It's not. College Football Reference has their SRS rating, which is a simple rating system, which is what it stands for, which they use to rate teams over time. I went through and I used it kind of as a guideline. That's the highest rated SRS team of all time to never win a national title. It was at, let me check it real quick.
27 or something.
27.39.
It's stupid.
Which is a lot higher than most of the teams that win national titles.
Yeah, most national champs are around 21, 22.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the other thing is you go through there, you're like, wow, no one was really good this year. No one was really good this year. Ohio State was incredible. And LSU was right behind them.
Yep.
The best college football team, best college football season by quarterback of all time, yet didn't have a higher rating there than the Buckeyes. I had them at 9. Bud, where'd you have them?
That Buckeye team I had at 6.
Danny says no go, not on the top 10.
Wow.
They might have.
Would they be in the top 20?
Big haters.
Yes, they're in the top 20.
Big 10 haters. That's what we are.
Yeah.
Am I up again?
I guess so then it's to me.
Oh,
right?
excuse me, Chip. That's right. Tom
Yeah.
went Ohio State. Apologies.
I'm in Ohio State. So USC is my number 1. That's off the board. Penn State, 1994 is number 2. That's off the board, which brings me to a back judge and his decision to wait just a beat
Oh,
before throwing out that flag and calling a pass interference that led to the Ohio State Buckeyes winning a national championship in double overtime. My number 3 best team not to win the national championship is the Miami Hurricanes of the 2002 season. They went a perfect 12-0 during the regular season. They were number 1 for the entire season, including at kickoff against Ohio State in the BCS National Championship game. That only defeat, of course, being by 1 score in double overtime. The entire roster is absolutely loaded, as you might expect, given the way that they came in from that 2001 squad. But it was not just the talent on the roster. But again, similar to the USC argument, I mean, there were just no close games. They had 1 close game against Pitt, but for the most part, they just absolutely ran through the entire schedule. Florida State, 28-27. So that was another 1-score game. Hurricanes were fantastic. So I knew that they were going to be top 5. I was splitting hairs when we started to figure out how this Hurricanes team was going to stack up against some of the others that I had up there in the 3, 4, and 5 position. But ultimately, I ended up moving them up to number 3. So my number 3 is the 2002 Miami Hurricanes.